Welcome to She Paid the Bills, the podcast that investigates, remembers and celebrates the women who made the movies. I'm your host, Sophie. After a bit of a summer break, we're back for more box office poison stories, and today is another good one. Let's travel back together to the year 1930. A woman with glamorous blonde curls and cheekbones that could cut glass is wearing a man's tuxedo, top hat tilted at a rakish angle. A cigarette dangles from her hand as she kisses another woman full on the mouth. This isn't some underground art film or scandalous European import. This is a major Hollywood production, and the woman in the tuxedo is about to become one of the biggest stars in the world. Her name was Marlene Dietrich, and she was unlike anything American audiences had ever seen. She was German, she was androgynous, she was sexually ambiguous, and she was absolutely magnetic. She not only challenged every convention about what a movie star should be, she overturned the idea of what a woman should look like and how they should live their life. But Marlene's story isn't just about breaking boundaries and shocking audiences. It's about survival and having the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when it could cost you everything. Because while Marlene Dietrich conquered Hollywood, she also made enemies of some of the most powerful people in the world, including Adolf Hitler himself. Today, we're diving into the life of a woman who, like the other women in our series, was branded box office poison in 1938. But that's almost the least interesting part of her story, and she proved that sometimes being a little bit dangerous is more important than being very profitable. This is the story of Marlene Dietrich, the woman who straight up told the Nazis to go to hell. Marie Magdalene Dietrich was born on December 27, 1901 in Berlin, Germany. Her childhood nickname was Lena, but when she was about 11, she decided to update it by combining her two first names to make Marlena. She grew up in what appears to have been a respectable middle-class family. Her father, Louis Otto Dietrich, was a former military officer turned imperial police lieutenant, while her mother came from a family that owned a successful jewelry business. But Marlene's comfortable childhood was shattered early when her father died, leaving her mother a widow with two small children. A few years later, her mother married Eduard von Losch, her late husband's best friend, who would become an important influence on young Marlene. Tragically, von Losch was killed in World War I, adding another layer of loss to Marlene's formative years, and another of the many reasons why she would grow to despise the idea of war. These early experiences of loss and instability would shape Marlene's worldview in profound ways. She learned early on that security was fleeting, the people you loved could disappear without warning, and you had to be strong enough to survive on your own, because you might have to. Before entering school, Marlene and her older sister Liesel were tutored at home, learning French, English, ballet, violin, and piano. An education that sounds a little bit dire to us, but was pretty progressive for the time. At the Augusta Victoria School for Girls, she continued to have private language and musical lessons, even learning to play the mandolin. This multilingual, artistic education would prove invaluable in her later career. Marlene's first serious ambition was to become a violinist. She practiced religiously and had real talent, but in her teens she suffered a wrist injury that ended this dream. As she later told an interviewer, "I sprained my wrist because I practiced on the violin 6 hours a day." While waiting for her hand to heal, she entered Max Reinhardt's School of Acting, where she discovered what would end up actually being her true calling. But while she may have learned her trade at the acting school, it was Berlin's cabaret scene that truly shaped the woman Marlene would become. Berlin in the 1920s was the global capital of queer culture, a city where anything seemed possible and where traditional boundaries of gender and sexuality were constantly being challenged. It was here that Marlene first performed what is considered the first lesbian cabaret song, My Best Girlfriend, a duet she performed with established French chanteuse Margot Léon. In her later memoir, Marlene claimed to have been unaware of the song's implications, writing that she was shocked when a review described the performance as androgynous. But to me, this sounds like Marlene is being obtuse for whatever reason. In reality, she most likely understood perfectly well what she was doing. She was learning that performance could be a form of resistance and that challenging audience expectations was a kind of power she could wield. The Berlin cabaret scene also taught Marlene that sexuality can be fluid and that the most interesting people were often those who refused to fit into conventional categories. She was beginning to develop what would become her signature style, simultaneously masculine and feminine, vulnerable and powerful, sophisticated and genuine. In 1923, Marlene married Rudolf Sieber, a production assistant she had met while working on the film Tragedy of Love. Not the best omen there. Their daughter Maria was born in 1924, but from the beginning this was not a conventional marriage by any means. Rudolf seemed to understand that Marlene wasn't going to be a traditional wife, and he accepted that her career and her freedom were more important to her than domestic life. In fact, she seemed to view her career as a number one priority because of her family. As Marlene later explained to radio interviewer and Gossip Girl queen Luella Parsons, who will be getting her own episode at some point, in 1931, combining motherhood with her career was possible, quote, "Because my daughter is the greatest incentive I could possibly have. I've never been so happy in my life as since I've had her." But this happiness didn't mean sacrifice. Marlene continued to pursue her ambitions while Rudolf managed most of the domestic responsibilities. Yet again, she was subverting society's expectations on gender roles. Throughout the 1920s, Marlene worked in Berlin's theatre and film industry, building a reputation as a talented and versatile performer. She appeared in several German films, but none brought her significant attention. What was becoming clear, however, was that Marlene had a unique screen presence that was both magnetic and mysterious. She was developing the distinctive mannerisms that would make her famous. The way she held a cigarette, the way she tilted her head, the way she could convey everything she was thinking with just a look. She was also experimenting with the androgynous style that would become her trademark, understanding instinctively that blurring gender lines gave her a kind of power that more conventional actresses didn't possess. But it wasn't until 1929 that Marlene Dietrich's life would change forever, when director Josef von Sternberg arrived in Berlin looking for an actress to play a destructive cabaret singer. The audition that would change Marlene's life almost didn't happen. Josef von Sternberg was in Berlin to cast the lead of Lola Lola in his adaptation of Heinrich Mann's novel Professor Unrat, which would become The Blue Angel. He had already tested dozens of actresses, but none had the dangerous combination of sexuality, vulnerability, and presence that the role required. Marlene's audition happened late in the casting process, and von Sternberg was reportedly ready to give up at this point. But when Marlene walked into the room, everything changed. She didn't just read for the part, she became Lola Lola. She understood instinctively that this character wasn't just a simple seductress, but a woman who used her sexuality as both a weapon and a shield, who was simultaneously powerful and trapped by the very system that gave her power. Von Sternberg was mesmerized. Here was an actress who could embody all the contradictions he wanted to explore. Beautiful but not conventionally pretty, confident but with hints of vulnerability, feminine but willing to claim traditionally masculine privileges. The Blue Angel was released in 1930 in both a German and an English version in true early European sound cinema style, and became an international sensation. Marlene's performance as Lola Lola was revolutionary. She sang the movie's main song, Falling in Love Again, in a voice that was both sultry and melancholy, and she moved through the staging with a confidence that was both alluring and slightly threatening. American audiences were fascinated and scandalized in equal measure, and Paramount immediately signed Marlene and von Sternberg to a contract and brought them to Hollywood. When Marlene was marketed as a mysterious European sophisticate who was both dangerous and desirable. Her first American film was Morocco in 1930, again directed by von Sternberg. The film featured the now iconic scene where Marlene, dressed in a man's tuxedo, kisses a woman in a nightclub audience before tossing a flower to Gary Cooper. It was a moment that crystallized everything fascinating about Marlene Dietrich. Her androgyny, her sexual confidence, and her complete disregard for conventional morality. The collaboration between Marlene and von Sternberg was intense and productive. It was relatively similar to Garbo's and Moritz Stiller's, as we spoke about in an earlier episode. it was also deeply personal. It's generally assumed that they were lovers, and their relationship seems to have formed their artistic partnership. Von Sternberg was definitely obsessed with Marlene, and she used that obsession to maintain control over her career and her image through him. This pattern would repeat throughout Marlene's life. She understood that her sexuality was a form of power, and she wasn't afraid to use it strategically, even with people she claimed to love. She had affairs with both men and women, often simultaneously, and seemed to view romantic relationships as yet another form of performance. Over the next few years, Marlene made a series of films with von Sternberg that cemented her status as one of Hollywood's biggest stars and legends. Dishonored in 1931, Shanghai Express in 1932, and Blonde Venus also in 1932. These films were visually stunning, with von Sternberg using lighting and cinematography to turn Marlene into a living work of art. But Marlene was more than just a beautiful face. She was incredibly smart about her career. She understood the business side of Hollywood in ways that many of her contemporaries didn't. She negotiated her own contracts, chose her own projects, and maintained tight control over how she was photographed and presented to the public at all times. She also developed a reputation as one of the most professional actresses in Hollywood and great to work with. Directors loved working with her because she understood filmmaking as a collaborative art form and was always looking for ways to improve the final product, not just her own vision or performance or look. On the other hand, her personal style was becoming as famous as her films. As she told an interviewer in 1960, quote, "I dress for the image, not for myself, not for the public, not for fashion, not for men." The image was, quote, "a conglomerate of all the parts I've ever played on the screen." When asked about her distinctive look, she explained with typical practicality, quote, "I've always had to have clothes made for me because of my unusual shape, broad shoulders, narrow hips." But she transformed what could have been an obstacle into her greatest asset, creating what would become known as the Dietrich silhouette. Her marriage to Rudolf Sieber continued throughout this period, but it remained unconventional. Rudolf managed Marlene's finances and helped raise their daughter Maria, while Marlene focused on her career and various love affairs. Rudolf himself had a long-term girlfriend, and him and his girlfriend would often go on holidays with Marlene, their daughter, and whatever lover she had going on at the time. It seems to have been refreshingly modern and surprisingly civil all around. By the mid-1930s, Marlene Dietrich was one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood, earning enormous amounts of money and living exactly the kind of life she had always wanted. She had homes in Hollywood and Paris, a wardrobe that was the envy of every woman in the world, and the freedom to love whomever she chose whenever she chose to. But the world was changing quickly. The rise of Nazi Germany was creating political pressures that would force her to make difficult choices, and in Hollywood, audiences were starting to grow tired of the sophisticated European characters she specialized in playing. The late 1930s brought a perfect storm of challenges for Marlene Dietrich. Her collaboration with Josef von Sternberg had ended with The Devil is a Woman in 1935, and she struggled to find projects that showcased her talents effectively. Films like The Desire in 1936 and Angel in 1937 failed to capture the magic of her earlier work. And as I said, audiences seemed to be growing tired of the sort of woman that she played so well and so often. But the bigger problem was political. As the Nazi Party consolidated power in Germany, Marlene's home country, she found herself caught between two worlds. The Nazis wanted her to return to Germany and become a symbol of German cinema. They offered her huge amounts of money and promised complete artistic control if she would come back and make films for the Reich. Hitler himself was reportedly a fan, and propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels made several attempts to lure her back. But Marlene was horrified by what the Nazis represented. She had grown up in Berlin's liberal cosmopolitan culture, and she understood that Nazi ideology was fundamentally opposed to everything she believed in. Their treatment of Jews, gay people, and other minorities was anathema to someone who had spent her career personifying sexual and social freedom. Marlene's response to the Nazi overtures was characteristically direct. She basically told them to fuck off. She refused all offers to return to Germany and began speaking out publicly against the Nazi regime. She was one of the first people to do so in Hollywood. This was an incredibly brave decision, which meant giving up any chance of working in her home country or even visiting it, and potentially putting family members like her mother, who was still in Germany, at risk. When the box office poison advertisement appeared in The Hollywood Reporter in May 1938, Marlene's name was prominently featured. The Independent Theatre Owners Association complained that she was poison at the box office, and that Paramount had shown, quote, cleverness and consideration for exhibitors by buying off Dietrich's contract, which called for one more picture. The accusation stung, but it wasn't entirely unfair. Her recent films had indeed disappointed at the box office, and Angel had been a particular disaster. But unlike some other actresses on the list, Marlene didn't seem devastated by the criticism. She had always been more interested in artistic integrity than commercial success, and she understood that her political stance was going to cost her professionally, even if her sort of creative choices weren't. Instead of trying to rehabilitate her image or compromise her principles, Marlene doubled down on her opposition to the Nazis. She began working with anti-Nazi organizations, helping Jewish refugees escape from Germany and raising money for the resistance movement in Germany. Her response to being labeled box office poison was typically defiant. When asked about the criticism, she reportedly said, "I would rather be box office poison than Nazi poison." But the political situation was taking its toll. Several of her films were banned in Germany. She was receiving death threats from Nazi sympathizers, and her family members in Germany were harassed by authorities. She was essentially declared persona non grata in her own home country. But Marlene never seems to have wavered. In 1939, she made the ultimate statement by becoming an American citizen and renouncing her German citizenship. The Nazi government responded by stripping her of her citizenship anyway and banning her films throughout the Reich. Between this and the general disinterest in her original on-screen persona, Marlene realized that if she wanted to continue working in Hollywood, she was going to have to reinvent herself completely. And Marlene Dietrich, who had been reinventing herself since her days in Berlin's cabarets, was more than up to the challenge. Her transformation began with Destry Rides Again in 1939, a Western comedy that paired Marlene with Jimmy Stewart. Many in Hollywood thought this was career suicide, and on paper I can't really blame them. Marlene Dietrich, who was the epitome of European sophistication, was going to play a down-to-earth saloon girl in a frontier town. But Marlene knew that she needed to show audiences a different side of herself if she wanted to remain relevant. And in Destry Rides Again, she played Frenchie, a tough, no-nonsense woman who could hold her own in a barroom brawl. It was still a sexually charged performance, but it was earthier and more accessible than her previous roles. The film was a huge success, both critically and commercially, and the famous scene where she fights with Una Merkel rolling around on a saloon floor became one of the most talked about moments in cinema in a year of many good films. Marlene had successfully reinvented herself and proved that she could challenge audience expectations when necessary. But even as she revitalized her Hollywood career, Marlene was becoming increasingly involved in the war effort. When World War II officially began, she threw herself into supporting the Allied cause with characteristic intensity. Marlene began performing for American troops, traveling to military bases and hospitals. These performances were very different from her movie roles. They were more intimate, more personal, and more emotionally direct. She would sing really emotional songs and connect with audiences in a way that were both professional and deeply human. And as I mentioned, her war work went far beyond just sort of entertainment. She used her Hollywood connections consistently to raise money for the war effort, worked with organizations helping Jewish refugees escape Nazi-occupied Europe, and she even gathered intelligence for the American government, using her contacts in the European film industry to provide information about Nazi activities. In 1944, Marlene made the ultimate commitment when she agreed to perform for troops on the front lines in Europe. This was incredibly dangerous work. She was traveling to active combat zones, often within range of enemy fire, but she felt it was her duty to support soldiers fighting against fascism. Her performances for troops became legendary. She would appear in her signature sequin gown, sometimes in the middle of a battlefield, and sing for soldiers who hadn't seen a woman in months. These performances combined her star power with her genuine patriotic fervor for her adopted home country. The soldiers adored her, He was one of the biggest movie stars in the world, risking her life to entertain them and boost their morale. And she didn't just perform and leave either. She spent her time talking with soldiers, signing autographs, and listening to their stories. Many veterans would later say that seeing Marlene Dietrich perform was one of the highlights of their war service. That wartime service was officially recognized with some of the highest honors available. In 1945, she was given the title of Daughter of the 71st Infantry Regiment. In 1947, she received the Medal of Freedom from the United States government, the highest honor that can be bestowed on a civilian. France awarded her the Légion d'honneur, and Belgium gave her the Knight Order of Leopold. But perhaps more meaningful to Marlene were the personal connections she made. In 1965, she told interviewer Betty Best that she still corresponded with soldiers she'd met during the war. She said, "They brought me their cherished medals to show they knew I had been with them during the war. So many from concentration camps who knew I worked against the Nazis, who told me it had helped them to know that someone they knew and respected was working for them outside." After the war, Marlene returned to making movies, but the film industry was yet again changing really quickly. The sophisticated European shtick was increasingly going out of fashion, and Hollywood in general was becoming less welcoming to the aging actresses of Marlene's generation. Her solution was typically practical. She reinvented herself once again and went back to being a cabaret performer. Starting in the 1950s, she began touring the world with a one-woman show that combined her greatest hits with newer material. These performances were intimate and powerful and allowed audiences to see a more vulnerable side of the legend. Her approach to aging was refreshingly honest for a Hollywood star, even by today's sort of rates. When asked in a 1969 interview whether she begrudged getting older, she replied, "No, God no, why should I? I think irrevocable things you cannot begrudge. If you have any bit of intelligence." America has a youth complex. In particular with me, they adore to make me older, and I don't see why they should do that because it's bad enough as it is. Although it is worth noting that while claiming to be so open to and accepting of the aging process, she was definitely no stranger to heavy-duty plastic surgery and adjustments. She was also always frank about her relationship with fame and adulation. She said, "I think if you have any sort of intelligence, you can't succumb to adoration, because people adore so many things. They also adore things that you think quite worthless, so you can't take it too seriously." Marlene's personal life remained unconventional to the end. Her marriage to Rudolf Sieber lasted until his death, though they rarely lived together. She continued to have relationships with both men and women, including notable affairs with writers Ernest Hemingway and Erich Maria Remarque, actress Mercedes Ruehl, and many others. Marlene's compassion for people in trouble was evident throughout her late years as well. When she visited the UK, she was urged to go see Coventry Cathedral, but she declined, saying she preferred to spend time with Dennis, a young man with multiple sclerosis who worked the theatre lights. She said, "Each night I used to share my champagne with him and we talked and talked." When she learned he couldn't write due to his condition, she sent him a typewriter so, quote, "he can go bang with one finger and write me." Her philosophy of life seems to have been shaped by her war experience and her sort of understanding of what truly mattered in life. In her 1969 interview, she spoke passionately about her anti-war beliefs. Quote, "Surely I'm anti-war. I don't think there's anybody that is for war. I mean, women. Maybe generals are for war. Professional soldiers might be, I don't know. But I've never found a woman who is for war." End quote. Marlene continued performing well into the 1970s, but age and health problems eventually forced her to retire. She spent her final years as a recluse in her Paris apartment, rarely giving interviews or making public appearances. When she died in Paris on May 6, 1992, at the age of 90, the entertainment world mourned the loss of one of its last great legends. Looking back at Marlene Dietrich, what makes her story so compelling might be how she managed to be both completely authentic and utterly constructed at the same time. As she told an interviewer in 1960, "If I dressed for myself, I wouldn't bother at all. Clothes bore me, I'd wear jeans." Yet her careful curation of her image was itself a form of authenticity. She was being true to her understanding of what it meant to be a star. Her approach to gender and sexuality was similarly complex. She wasn't just playing with masculine and feminine codes for shock value. She seems to have been expressing something fundamental about her own identity and challenging audiences to expand their own understanding and acceptance. And at the end of the day, she was challenging people to not take it so seriously. The fact that she could kiss a woman on screen in 1930 and have it be seen as tantalizing rather than scandalous speaks to her extraordinary ability to push boundaries and still remain commercially viable. She seems to have understood that controversy could be a form of power if you handled it correctly and took it just far enough. When she later on chose to risk her career and her safety to oppose the Nazis, she was making a statement about the role of art and artists in moral crisis. And she proved that being branded box office poison didn't have to be the end of the story, or even slightly the more interesting part of a story. She showed that every now and then reinvention is absolutely possible and that risks can pay off. And sometimes the most important thing isn't whether other people like you, but whether you can live with yourself and your choices. In our series about the women who were labelled as toxic to Hollywood, Marlene's story stands out because she seemed to have embraced her reputation as dangerous. She understood that being threatening to the status quo was often a sign that you were doing something important. "I am at heart a gentleman," she once said, and I think that might be the perfect summary of Marlene Dietrich. Next time, we'll explore another woman from that infamous box office poison list, Mae West, the comedian who turned sexual innuendo into an art form and proved that sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Thank you for listening to She Paid the Bills. If you'd enjoyed this episode, please leave a rating wherever you're listening, share it with someone who loves stories of complicated, fascinating women, and follow us on TikTok and Instagram at She Paid the Bills Pod. See you next time.